everyone, and welcome back to Forethought, a podcast series dedicated to raising awareness about mental health and well-being through lived experience stories. So today I'm joined by Louise Thompson, an accredited mental health social worker, clinical supervisor, who is now dedicated to working with teams and workplaces to improve psychological safety and individual well-being through trauma-informed change interventions. So Louise, how you doing?
Hey, Joel. That was a lovely intro. Thank you.
I nearly mumbled a few of those words, I'm not going to lie, but we got through it. Today's a really exciting episode and really, awesome. Thanks for giving me your time because we're talking all things psychological safety and psychosocial hazards today, which is, I guess, a big topic based on the legislation that was introduced last year. Really excited to unpack that with you a bit more. But to start off with, can you give our listeners a bit of a Louise 101?
Sure, I would love to. How long have we got? Let's just go with like my last 10-year work career history of sorts. So my background's in social work. I did a master's of social work 10 years ago, essentially. Most of my working life, I've been in mental health. But I guess I call myself a bit of a dabbler. I like to have my fingers in lots of different pies. I like to experience different workplaces, different environments. So I've also run my own personal training business during that time. And I've run my own personal private practice during that time, which I still have. I sort of leverage that towards supervision, which is what I still do and still love. So I do clinical supervision and group coaching and group therapy. But in terms of my mental health experience, I've had some really amazing opportunities to work with like some really big organizations like Beyond Blue and Lifeline, and most recently Headspace. And it's been pretty cool to see how the industry has changed, I guess, in the 10 years that I've been around. I think just now where we're at is a really, really interesting space because the clinical work and the clinical, knowledge and language that I'm very familiar with is now becoming a bit more common in our workplace environment. People are really happy to start having these conversations. The stigma, I think, is becoming much more reduced. So it's pretty exciting to see where it's going. But obviously that leads to its own challenges when things that, become more of a norm can, I guess, be led by people who have interest and desire, but not necessarily the knowledge and the know-how and all the, training that I would love to see people who are talking about it in this space have.
Yeah, because I remember a while ago now I came and did a training, suicide awareness training with you, and that was probably one of the first times I'd done a training like that, which was more on the really suicide prevention or like encouraging people or empowering them with the skills to ask somebody who they think might be struggling and then what they can do immediately after that, which is, I thought, really a really interesting training just for the common person like myself to be able to have some kind of awareness and understanding of what to do if you just ran into someone on the street, for example, who might really be struggling, which 10 years ago that never existed at all.
Never. And, you came to my training and I think the thing that we all like loved and got out of it was seeing what different people's understanding and different organizations are doing in the way that they're talking about mental health and promoting mental health and reducing those stigma. Because exactly like the people that we had attending the training were really engaged, they were keen, like they wanted to take what they were learning back to not just their community, which is, I think where we're at 10 years ago, it was sort of all what was happening in the community. And now it's more in everyone's everyday life. It might be the conversations you're having with your friends and family, might be the conversations you're having at work, or it might be just conversations that, we're having across the board in all of the different aspects of our life. So I think, like you said, that sort of suicide prevention training, that's new and it's still stigma breaking, but we are getting much better, I think, about having those conversations, normalizing it, and also think about ways that we can make change to help people be not only just more aware, but like what can we actually do, right? Like that are you okay stuff that everyone's really across. cool, what's the next step? I think that's what we're sort of looking at now.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, quite interesting for the next topic, like what's happening in the psychological health and safety industry now. Like, I guess we had the legislation that came out last year, it's starting to trickle down into like, what does this mean for everyday businesses of any size? So yeah, can you kind of talk us through that, like what the legislation means and yeah, what's happening across the industry because of that?
Yeah, I'll go a little backwards because my first exposure to this or interest within this space, I guess, was through COVID, through our lockdown periods. So when I was in, I guess, more of a leadership role in our mental health industry, understanding what our psychological safety and then our psychological health and safety responsibility for my staff and my teams was something that I did spend a fair bit of time trying to get my head around, trying to understand, because with working in mental health and then having staff's mental health impacted by things like, lockdowns, isolation, but also trying to support other young people at that stage, we were looking at that kind of like cumulative trauma lens. And so that's sort of where my interest sort of first peaked on that. And then since then, I've been really trying to follow it and understand about what's happening in my sector, which is community services or not-for-profit or health. And then I guess in that global sector as well, like what and how are businesses doing or changing the ways of working to help their staff and employees have better mental health at work. So your question, yes, so massive changes. It's pretty exciting. Sad that it had to come to the fact that we have a stick rather than a carrot, right? Like,
yeah.
So I guess the compliance changes means that organizations and staff are now liable for their psychological health and safety of their workers. So if there are instances where it's deemed that the staff member was placed in an unsafe environment that caused a psychological injury, then the workplace is now possibly being fined or taken to court or have investigations by things like WorkSafe New South Wales or any of those sort of regulatory bodies. So there is an onus then on the workplace to make sure that what they're doing is actually keeping the staff healthy and well. There's a little bit of, I think, confusion or trickiness to get like your head around the whole thing, because what psychological safety and psychological health and safety are similar but different. And I know that's, I think, where the start of the confusion happens for people or teams. And it is super confusing. Like all of this stuff and this language is really, I think, new for a lot of people. And managers already have 1,000 things that they have to worry about, let alone, new laws and legislations and things like that. So the way that I guess think about it, so you got your psychosocial health and safety that sits within your workplace health and safety kind of compliance space. So just the same as you have your physical management, like your ergonomics and your PPE, you also have things that you can manage in the environment to protect your workers. And when you think about that psychosocial dynamic, it's really thinking about not just the staff member in themselves, but that bigger picture. So you have lots of different things that contribute to someone's well-being, which can be the personal relationships they have, but it can also be the work environment, the work culture, the policies and procedures, the processes, all different levels, I guess, that impacts on someone's psychological well-being. And then if you look at the psychological safety, which, it's really great that people are starting to talk about this at work. That's based really on something Amy Edmondson and I've forgotten the other researcher, have done lots of work around in the last probably 10, 15 years. Initially to try and understand how teams function in the best way possible. And the research really does show that it's about sharing with confidence, being okay to make mistakes, and creating an environment where people can share things without worrying about negative repercussions, essentially. And that's very much that interpersonal safety or inter-team safety. So it's about the relationships you have with your manager, with your peers, and it just kind of is just in that environment. So that one-to-one level, rather than considering all of the other options that go alongside it. So I always, like, I'm very systems thinker. So I always think about circle, bigger circle, and then bigger circle. And they all sort of fit within that sort of babushka doll metaphor somewhere.
Yeah, thank you for using the babushka doll metaphor. Now it kind of all makes sense. So I guess psychological, like, that's kind of the separation, I guess, in layman's terms would be like culture versus compliance, right? It's kind of like how people feel going to work every day. Can I talk to my colleague at the water cooler or whatever, and I feel comfortable in meetings, sharing new ideas, versus, I guess, the compliance side, which is really what's now an onus based off this new legislation.
Definitely. And I think it helps to understand that you have both and you have responsibilities for both. But obviously your compliance piece is what's going to be sitting within the legislation and the regulations. But if you are looking at adjusting your culture, then it's most likely that they're going to impact on each other. They sort of, they do interact with each other.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess, that's where, I guess, things like employee assistance programs, EAPs, they all kind of do a small part in this. But like you said, that's probably like one of the very small eggs within the babushka doll. And so there's like the layers on top of that where it's like, transitioning from a point of view where you're like, oh, you're struggling at work, go call this hotline number, to maybe being like, oh, you're struggling at work, let's go grab a coffee and maybe have a chat about what's going on. And sort of as a manager, I guess, taking that on board a little bit more, and instead of outsourcing it, being more involved in your team and having those conversations to make them feel comfortable. Is that sort of, if I'm trying to get my head around this, sort of on track?
Yeah. And I guess like my sort of thing that I would always suggest to a team leader if they're having those conversations is either asking the person who's coming to them initially, or having that wider conversation with the team about, is this something that's just occurring for you, or is this something that's happening for our whole team?
Yeah.
And that's a really good place to just start to try and unpack what's going on. Like someone's coming to you saying, I'm really stressed about work. Okay. Is that just going on for you? Is this our whole team that's starting to feel stressed and overwhelmed about work? Because that's a bigger systemic picture, right? And yes, EAP might really support that person in that moment, but then the team leader has a responsibility for the team in the environment and the organization as well to sort of say, well, is the culture that we're creating then creating an unsafe environment for our whole team, that people are then being exposed to these ongoing stresses?
Yeah, so that kind of comes into some of the, the 14 hazards in the legislation. So role overload, of course, would be the first thing that springs to mind there. And like role overload might be coming from, if you're in a larger organization, from higher up into a whole team and impacting the whole team rather than it just being isolated. So I guess that's kind of why with managers, if you talk to your team, have that open conversation with them and everyone's feeling the pressure, then as a manager, I guess that's your role to then go up a level and be like, every single person in my team is really struggling with this. And that's where the legislation then starts to come in, because you're going up into one of the different levels of the doll. And then you're kind of looking at it across the organization to be like, okay, cool. So that's kind of, I guess, did I kind of get that right in terms of how it's laddered up?
Yes, very, very much so. And, I think if people think of examples, right, like think of some of the big four banks or even lawyer programs, those first jobs that people are going out to, your sort of graduate jobs or your internship roles, like we've all heard about the fact that these staff members are working like 80 hours a week, 100 hours a week, or any of those sort of things. And that's a cultural norm. Yeah, it's the expectation that in your first role, you are the dog's body and you do everything for everyone and you don't get the chance to say no. that's a whole of culture approach of the way that they induct and onboard their new employees with the expectation, you know, that maybe some of them are going to progress and get promoted and stuff like that. But it'll be really interesting to see with this legislation, like how does that impact those work styles and those organizations? Because there has been instances where they've been in the papers recently, you know, that staff have been speaking out about how that's impacting on their mental health, that there's certainly been some questions about sexual harassment and bullying and things like that. And that's really that example of more of that organizational or team-based climate where you could say most definitely that that's having a really negative impact on a whole workload, a whole staff member or cohort of 100 new grads coming into this environment.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And it's a difficult thing as well. Like going back to, you know, my first role, it was just sort of like, you're young, you want to get in there, you want to make a really good impression. So it's just, you do whatever you're asked to do, essentially. You don't kind of even challenge it. And then that kind of leads to a whole bunch of other difficulties down the track. Or maybe when you become a manager, you just do that because that's what happened to you. And so you get this never cycle of, oh, I had to do that, so does everyone else when I'm kind of the manager.
Yeah. And then, you have this mindset of, well, you can't complain because I had to put up with it as well. So, you know, that's just the way we do things here. And I do think that there's a big shift coming. I think there's some changes, definitely. Like this is just the first piece of the puzzle. But I think as well, workers have some more autonomy and some more feeling like they can voice their concerns about how things and how they're feeling and how they're being treated.
Yeah. Okay, so that's quite a nice segue then into voicing concerns and I guess workers doing so. And then as an organization, like there's this process now in the legislation around, you know, best practice for remaining compliant or being in the best possible position to be compliant. So if I'm, you know, an organization of about, you know, 100 people, say, or whatever, like what would you recommend to get started? Like what are the kind of, you know, psychosocial hazards for dummies book?
Yeah. And, you know, like I said, it is complex. So every organization is going to be different. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind because way that this organization works is going to be completely different from the way that this organization works. And so some of those hazards will be similar and some will be different. And some will be in certain teams or certain ways of working. And so the interventions or the solutions that you're coming up with are also going to be individualized. And so, you know, the handbook dummies is probably going to be 300 pages long, which is fine. But I think it's just really important that people aren't like, well, it's just a tick box. I can't just be like, I do A, B, C, D, and then I've met my requirements. There's far more nuance that goes into it. And, you know, because we're dealing with people and people are nuanced and there's always scales of gray and that's the reality. So yeah, first is sort of having a look at your workplace. Like if you're a manager, just having a think, okay, am I office based? Do I have staff off site? Do I work like shift work? What sort of tasks are my staff doing? And sort of some of those things about the cultural norms. And then maybe having a chance to reflect on like what are some of the things people are either bringing to our team meetings or our one-on-ones that they're finding challenging. And that's just sort of that information gathering piece where you're having a think about, what's my workplace looking like? What do I need? And then that's when you sort of go into that next step about assessing and then putting in some interventions. And so I think the assessment piece is probably the bit where people or managers get most scared because they think, okay, if I open this door, everyone's going to come to me with every single complaint under the world. And I'm going to be inundated with having to change my whole way of working. And that, you know, people are going to use it as leverage and they're going to say that, you know, we're in an unsafe environment, all those sort of things, which, you know, I think that's understandable when you feel like you're not quite sure where your responsibilities lie and the boundaries lie of your role and what you're supposed to do. So I guess the thing to keep in mind is that those non-compliance pieces means that the hazard or the risk itself has to be ongoing and enduring, and it has to be something that's going to cause likely psychological harm. And most of them are going to be a combination of different things. So even when we were talking about that job demands, like having very long working hours and very high workload in itself is, yes, a potential hazard. But then layering one or two of the other domains over the top means that that's when it starts to become something that you do need to sort of look at and address things. So it might be work demands, a lack of support, so people who are working completely in isolation or not able to ask for help. And then it might be as well like interpersonal conflict or team conflict within the environment. So again, there's that kind of like psychological unsafe environment where people not only can't ask for help, but they're also stressed and they don't feel like they have resources to help them in that situation.
So another one of those overlapping examples could be, yeah, like bullying and role overload. So then the role overload by itself is okay, but then if you're getting chronically bullied or something by a manager or somebody else, even though you're working really long hours, then that's when the stress starts to build. If you're spending 80 hours in the office a week, losing some work-life balance, and then when you are in there doing the extra hours, the additional layer of that systematic bullying kind of coming in, that's when you're going to probably look to be moving on into another role or just sort of feeling really average.
Mm-hmm. And even like touching on that, so you looking at things like single incident trauma in the workplace. So, you know, some workplaces mean that people might be exposed to more both, I guess, physical injuries or fatalities, or the nature of their work means that they are listening to people's stories of abuse or harm or things like that. The research shows that for those sort of traumatic injuries, the more that people are resourced, the more likelihood that they will recover in what we would consider a reasonable amount of time. And the less resources that they have is the more likely that they will then have a prolonged recovery period, which then leads to things like PTSD, right?
Yeah.
So thinking in that resource space, it is about, yeah, like who are your supports and sort of what is your workload demands and how are you able to ask for help in those sort of situations. So those sort of, yeah, like those kind of really crisis spot injuries or psychological harm where they have it in that moment, everything that's around it has as much impact as the actual nature of the event as well.
Yeah. And so I guess that's quite interesting with the assessment, because I know in the legislation, engaging with your workers when you are doing the assessment is a really important piece. And I guess that's in part to uncover silent hazards or things that might be bubbling along, but then also to get a bit of their input about what supports would be useful if situation X happens. So that, to your point, you're setting them up for success as best you can as an employer if this unlikely event does actually happen because of the nature of your work.
Totally. And having that space for your staff to give you feedback is actually what's going to not only create a safe place and a safe environment and a psychological safe conversation, but it's also going to foster as many interventions and solutions as you can come up with that will be useful. So your workers are the ones doing the work. Like they will have ideas about what they think would benefit them. And so if they're coming to you, yeah, saying these are my challenges, this is what's going on, great, amazing. Like have that conversation about this is what I think's happening. Is this your guys' still sense of the idea? And how do you think we can help you? Like what do we need to look at that would be beneficial?
Yep. And I know that's quite interesting, as well as one of the hazards is really around that organizational justice piece. So that's quite interesting, I think. And I know you'll have stronger thoughts on this than me, but like if I speak up to someone, do I feel that something will happen? It's almost one of the most important things, right?
Yes, 100%. I think that's really that kind of biggest babushka doll almost, like that's that outlying one that means that whatever's happening internally that needs to be really solid and centered. And so like organizational justice is that sense of if I make a report, then my manager will take me seriously, or my team leader. If my report is investigated, I feel that it will be investigated fairly with due diligence and proper process. And then it's also about the outcome of the report. I feel that that will be understood in a fair way within the team and within my organization. So, you know, if it's a substantiated or unsubstantiated report, it's still about, okay, can I maintain my place in the workplace without still feeling like that I've got a target on my back, essentially.
Yeah.
So if workers are coming to work and they feel, yep, okay, I know sometimes things might not work in the way they should, but I know that my workplace supports a proper process that if that was to happen and that I was going to make that report, they will continue to do their work and feel safe in that environment and have those transparent and open conversations. If they don't, then they're never going to speak up anyway. They'll be like, what's the point? You know, nothing's going to change, or I'm then going to become a target myself.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, yeah, the biggest stole, I guess, in the stack, or the most important one, is really that, in terms of if I'm thinking about myself being a director or a manager of an organization, if my workers aren't feeling like they're comfortable to help me identify these risks in the first place, then that's where they're just going to kind of, you know, be swept under the rug, be happening in the background until there is a situation where something bad has happened multiple times and nothing's been done about it, which is, I guess, where this stick starts coming in.
Yeah. And I think, again, like, I think that's one of the biggest things to keep in mind, that it has to be that enduring thing. And so, yeah, if someone's come to you once and you're like, look, I think I'm trying to figure it out. I don't really know what I'm doing, but, you know, I'm giving my best shot. But if someone's come to you, you know, 4, 5, 6 times about harassment or bullying and nothing's happened, then the regulators are going to look on that very unfavorably. And that's when you are, you know, much more at risk of being in trouble to not meet your compliance standards.
Yeah, sorry, we were just interrupted by the bell there.
The bell, I didn't even hear it.
You didn't hear the doorbell. Okay, that's good. Hopefully it doesn't come out in the recording. So yeah, I guess that is quite interesting. And it really is, yeah, once again, it kind of comes back to managers being like, okay, I've heard this multiple times now. I need to then put in some controls that are going to mitigate this in the future. And I guess that's the third step of this, right? Is like developing those controls in an organization. I guess what's the best way to sort of go about that part of the process?
Yeah, and I guess that's again about like individualizing it specific to your workplace. I think, again, it doesn't actually have to be like 100 different controls. It doesn't have to be one control for every single thing that someone's identified, because again, most of them overlap. So by looking or addressing one, you're most likely then going to be able to address a couple in this instance. And you also want to give yourself time to implement them. There's no point trying to be like, look, I'm going to put these 10 new strategies in, and in 6 months, I'll see how I've gone, because like that's far too much all at once. You're much better off trying to think about like 2 or 3 like really solid strategies that you think will work and how you can implement them with the teams.
Yeah.
So like something with your work demands one, it would be going back to the team and saying, okay, like, what can we do to better support you? And they might come up with all sorts of different solutions. It might be about, you know, how do they redistribute workload? It might be about, you know, what do we feel our workload capacity is and how can we measure that, you know, so that we're always sort of working at a 70 to 80%. So we've got time to pick up those crisis things that sort of come in, and how does that look and how do we share that within our team? Or is it, you know, just about our work hours and our days, and can we see if we can do, you know, flexible working hours? That means we start at 8 and we finish at 4 some days, and start later, because that actually meets the demands of our clients. But it also means that we then aren't sort of trapped in working in ways that we have to work overtime because people want to meet at 5 p.m.
Yeah. And so I guess an example of this would be a classic if you're on like a quarterly sales cycle and you have, you know, your end of quarter sales numbers to report. And so you've got a massive week. It might be something where your controls that you put in place is like, this is a part of the job. It's unavoidable. And you're going to have a really big week. And then maybe on the Monday or the Tuesday, the week after, we sort of have, you know, 2 days of more of a wind down, or maybe we do some like, I don't know, a group activity or something where it's less intense, acknowledging the fact that that week is always just going to be really intense every quarter. And so there, I
Yep,
guess, some
yep.
examples of some of the different controls you can put in place, and then track whether people feel better the next quarter after it worked or not.
And that's the part, you know, about the controls, is about it needs to be tracked or monitored to make sure that it's getting its results or improving people's, you know, work experience. So if that's the one you've come up with, you then need to have your tool or your way that you're going to track and monitor to, again, keep within that compliance framework, and retest again, sort of in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, if that has improved people's work experience. I guess having an idea of how your organization wants to keep a track of all these hazards or controls is something that really probably sits out of the manager's scope. That does certainly sit more with that work health and safety or HR piece, for them to get more of a systems perspective about, you know, how does our organization as a whole keep a track of all of these together. And then that, I guess, then above that sits with your leaders, because they are the ones who have to decide that it's valuable and meaningful for the work and the workers, that they'll invest time and money and a strategy to make sure that, you know, it is something that is that ongoing and collaborative process.
Yeah. And I guess that's quite important, I guess, from a leadership standpoint in the beginning, before all of this as well. Like you mentioned, looking at some of that historic data, like, you know, are there more sick days in certain times of the year than others? Or like, am I seeing these patterns or trends emerging from different areas of the business? And obviously, as your business gets bigger, it'll become, you know, slightly more difficult to aggregate all of that data together. But I guess, yeah, that's why it's really important to get some kind of, you know, survey out to everyone in the business, start collecting all of this information so that you can go through the process. And then, like you said, reviewing it 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, whatever that review cycle is. But it's basically like looking at each hazard. Being like, was there any incidents reported after we put in place these controls? No. And then, okay, great. And it doesn't have to be that, you know, extensive or complicated. It just needs to be kind of systematic.
Correct. And, you know, workplaces are familiar with this. And like I said, that workplace health and safety stuff, which is all about the physical, it's just applying a slightly different lens. And I guess something that is a little bit frustrating or probably challenging for leaders is understanding what that means, because a lot of the information out there and a lot of, I guess, the self-promotion out there is about workplace well-being, which is not going to meet your compliance, and it actually is not going to meet all of those different levels like we spoke about. So, you know, your workplace well-being interventions, that's things like mental health webinars or yoga or mindfulness apps. They're still very much that individualized intervention, and like we talk about, that's good. But it's not actually a systemic solution. It's not going to help your workplace as a whole. And, you know, the research that's coming out now shows that those interventions, that there's often like no follow-up to see if they had any benefit, which is not surprising. But the research now that has actually tracked some of them shows that there's actually not any benefit at all. Some workers even feel worse after going to things like those resilience trainings, because it really does put the emphasis back on the solution, and the problem sits with you as the worker. And we need to think much more bigger picture, because it's a whole of organizational approach.
Yeah. It'll be quite interesting as well. I know that just before Christmas, there was a bunch of cases that came out. I think this is probably one of the most important things to reiterate, is like, this legislation is not out to get everyone. It's out to get the organizations that are stringing up their apprentices with cable and hanging them, you know, from scaffolding. And, you know, it's probably out to get, you know, 0.1% of people who are just doing the wrong thing. And having that really simple kind of approach of just following this process and doing these things, like, it's not going to be scary. And if someone comes knocking on your door asking, like, can I see stuff? You're like, okay, cool. Here's all of our processes, procedures, and here's all of our reviews and everything logged in one place, and off you go.
100%. Like, if you can show the evidence that you have started the process, you've got some ideas, you've got procedures and policies in place, and you are looking at implementing a small amount of changes that you think are going to have the biggest benefit for your staff, then you are really working within that compliance framework and you're doing okay. It's the ones that are sweeping it under the rug, pretending it doesn't exist, ignoring all the smoke signals or the red flags that are coming from their workplace, or doing the survey to the organization and then doing nothing with it and going, okay, I've done my bit because I've actually asked the workers, and I think that I've ticked the box to say that, yep, my staff are happy at work and having the a good experience and stuff. But getting that feedback and then going, oh, too hard basket, well, I'm sure that no one will notice if I just hide this evidence somewhere.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the other interesting point about it as well, is like it's a retention piece as well as a compliance piece. Like doing these things and making sure that you're going through this process will make workers feel more comfortable in your organization, and it'll make them feel like they can talk up about things that are going on, and that then creates that that safety in the organization, that they feel valued and cared for, and that's going to help you keep people longer.
Totally. And if you can have that in your team, like as a manager, that's going to be the number one reason why people stay. Like that saying, people leave because of bad managers. Of course, that is 100% true. So if you can implement a few strategies for yourself and your team that make people feel valued, wanted, psychological safe, and like have future within this business, then yeah, that is a retention strategy, and it's going to make people more engaged and more motivated to be at work as well. Safe workers, people who aren't stressed and in crisis mode, much more creative, much more engaged, and much more like collaborative with other people within their team. So it is actually in that benefit where you think about it, all the ways that people will be much happier and much more engaged and much more productive at work.
Very good. Yeah, I guess it wasn't the lightest of reading, that 60-page kind of legislative document that came out. A little bit dry, but I think, yeah, if you unpack it, put in, the 4-step process, and then kind of have these things that are always on, then you should be in a really good spot. I guess the main thing is just like, if someone comes and says something's happening, just say, okay, yeah, I'll look into it. Or like, it's just can be so simple rather than straight up denial. Like it's kind of just like a few key steps is like, don't deny initially, just like have a look, see if it's real.
Yeah. I think, there's almost like that default to be like, oh, they're coming to me with a problem. What's, putting it back onto them. What's the solution? Or you tell me what to do. And instead having that open conversation, like, can I get a bit more of an understanding what's going on? Yeah. Are you stressed at work? Yeah, cool. Is that an experience for everyone? Okay, great. So now we've got some more understanding and data about what's going on. Let's start to unpack that, and how can we support you? What does that look like?
Yeah. No, awesome. I think, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens over the next 3 to 6 months. I know that the regulators, now that they've put this out, are really going to be looking to enforce it, because that's what regulators do. So yeah, I guess thank you so much for coming on and unpacking it. And I guess if anyone does have any questions, then reach out, to the team here at Foreline. We're really lucky to be working with Louise to kind of develop all of this out. And yeah, I know that the next 6 months will be quite a dynamic space as people get across this and staff get across this and what it all means. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But thank you so much for giving me some of your time today.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks for having me. Always happy to chat. And I hope that, that's helpful for managers who are in this space. So yeah, like you said, looks forward to seeing what comes next.
Awesome. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you everyone for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.